Thank you very much indeed. It's a delight to see you all here on a rainy day. Coming as I do from the United Kingdom, this is just like home. Anyway, before I actually get into it, I'd just like to say that this is a topic that I never learnt at school in UK. I really had to read it all up and study. I went into the Federalist Papers, for which I have a high regard. The Founder's Second Amendment, look how thick that book is, and even Deer Hunting with Jesus. And Deer Hunting with Jesus, I found that there is actually a website which is christiandeerhunters.org, and if you consult that website you will find that they have a book called Devotions for Deer Hunters. How about that? So my research with this and all the internet took me down a long historical path, and that's what I want to actually go down today with you. There are always certain minefields for speakers that are best avoided, and this is one of them. Wherever one might set foot, one might tread on a mine, and in venturing in this area you may think me either brave or foolhardy or perhaps downright stupid. Nevertheless, press on I must, because there's a question that has long puzzled me. How is it that in the matter of guns in civilian hands, the United States has gone down a track that is quite different from every other democratic, industrialized country? The Second Amendment reads as follows, as you can see. And in the next 40 minutes or so, I want to explore the roots of the right to keep and bear arms. Why two verbs, to keep and to bear? Was the right to bear arms for the purpose of self-defense, or was it to assert public order and safety, or both? What was the derivation of the militia? Was the purpose of the well-regulated militia to participate in local security and law enforcement, or to deter tyrannical government, or both? And how have these matters evolved so that with less than 5% of the world population, it has been estimated that the United States now has over 40% of the world's civilian-owned guns? That's a huge number. Now, this is not a talk on what should be done about the situation in the form of gun control. I'm happy to leave that to the discussion afterwards if you so wish. But I do think it's worth reviewing how and why this unique state of affairs has come about. So I ask you to bear with me over some history, for as so often the attitudes that we have today lie in the antecedents of the past. In the search for an answer, we need to begin at the beginning. With some notable exceptions, standing armies are a comparatively recent invention. An early example was in Roman times, when the constant availability to the successive Caesars of military contingents of trained men was an integral part of the power projection of Rome. In later years, there were waves of organized invasions, such as that by Genghis Khan and his Mongol army of 80,000 well-trained and experienced fighters. But in medieval Europe, with its kings and princes and local barons, there were no such things as standing armies at all. Neither was there any organized civic law and order. Every man needed to be able to protect his family, his home, and his animals from marauders and thugs. And also in these times, many people were not free men. They were serfs and villains, not villains in crooks, villains, who owed loyalty to the local barons and landowners, and who in turn owned their loyalty to the king. In times of war, each serf or villain was required to present himself with his weapon, be it a pike, a halberd, as you can see here, pike, a halberd, or even a club, when called upon by his monarch. Thus an armed militia existed only as need arose, and once war was over, these armed peasants then returned to their families and their work in the fields. And of course they kept their arms for self-protection. In England, by the 1600s, the development of Parliament was beginning to intrude on the powers of absolute monarchy. If the king needed an army, he needed money, and he needed the approval of Parliament. One of the unhappinesses in the 1640s that led to civil war in England and the beheading of King Charles I in 1649 was his raising of an army in 1642 solely under his own authority rather than a militia under the authority of Parliament. And as we know, by the mid-1600s, settlers from England were beginning to arrive on the east coast of America. Many were seeking religious freedom or simply escaping from harsh economic conditions or political disputes between Catholics and Protestants. Now, the application of English common law in the colonies had been established as far back as 1606, when King James I had declared in a charter granted to the Virginia Company that the inhabitants of the colony, quote, shall have and enjoy all liberties, franchises and immunities, to all intents and purposes as if they had been abiding and born within this realm of England. And so it was that as more and more settlers came across the Atlantic in the late 1600s and the 1700s to start new lives, the well-read and the educated already had an established distaste for standing armies in times of peace and a clear understanding of the people's rights, including the right to bear arms. And in the rugged conditions of their new lives, the settlers needed their weapons for their personal security and for hunting. Militia units were formed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1636. And in 1645, Massachusetts law had required that, quote, all inhabitants are to have arms in their houses fit for service, unquote. Now, to keep arms, therefore, meant not just ownership, but also upkeep and maintenance in serviceable condition. And that brings us to the definition of how the difference between to keep arms and to bear arms. In England in 1685, Catholic King James II had decreed that only Catholics should be allowed to bear arms. He lasted only 3 years until he was overthrown, and in settling once and for all the succession of the crown on his Protestant daughter, Queen Mary, and her husband from Holland, William, Parliament decided to put into writing these ancient rights and liberties. King James II was accused of various transgressions and abuses of established rights, such as causing several good subjects being Protestants to be disarmed at the same time when Papists were both armed and employed contrary to law. And he was also accused of raising and keeping a standing army within this kingdom in time of peace without consent of Parliament and quartering soldiers contrary to law. And you can already begin to see that what appears in the American Constitution was going all the way back here. So the outcome was the English Bill of Rights of 1689. And among a long list of provisions, it was specified that the raising or keeping a standing army within the kingdom in time of peace, unless it be with the consent of Parliament, is against law. And the subjects which are Protestants may have arms for their defence, suitable to their conditions and as allowed by law. Thus, I would argue that the American right to keep and bear arms is solidly rooted in ancient liberties and solidly rooted in the English Bill of Rights of 1689. And those are some of the freedoms guaranteed. And you can recognize in some of those, that's the English Bill of Rights of 1689, some of those elements which appeared later again in the Declaration of Independence and the subsequent Constitution. Now, by 1760 or thereabouts, the population of the English American colonies was already over 2 million people and rising. And trouble was brewing, particularly in Boston, The Stamp Act was passed in London in 1765. Intended as a means of paying off debts and contributing to the costs of maintaining soldiers in the colonies, it imposed on American colonists a tax on every piece of paper that was used. And then to enforce tax collection and to put down a rising tide of discontent, the Royal Governor of Boston asked London for more soldiers to be deployed to Boston, and then the residents found themselves required to accommodation for the redcoats, because in those days there was no such thing as military barracks. So with rough and ready soldiers imposed upon their households without the consent, imposed by the governor without the consent of the people, this understandably exacerbated the general unrest. At the time, the colonists still regarded themselves as Englishmen loyal to the crown, and therefore fully entitled to the same rights and the same liberties. And in September 1768, a stormy meeting took place in Faneuil Hall in Boston, and the gathering adopted a resolution which, recognizing the provisions of the English Bill of Rights, determined that every listed soldier and other householder shall always be provided with a well-fixed firelock, musket and accoutrements, down here, and as there is at this time prevailing apprehension in the minds of many of an approaching war with France. And the reference to the possibility of a war with France was, of course, no more than a very thinly veiled subterfuge. In a sense, it was the fake news of the day. On September 26, 1768, an anonymous patriot, signing his name only as ABC, issued this warning in the Boston Gazette. It is conjectured, number 1, that the inhabitants of this province are to be disarmed. Number 2, that this province is to be governed by martial law. And number 3, that a number of gentlemen who have exerted themselves in the cause of their country are to be seized and sent to Great Britain. Unhappy America, when thy enemies are rewarded with honours and riches, but thy friends are punished and ruined only for asserting their rights and pleading for thy freedom. Discontent continued to mount. In December 1773, the Boston Tea Party took place, and I don't need to tell you the rest of the story that led to July 1776 and to the long list of repeated injuries and usurpations committed by King George III. From these developments, perhaps we may draw, therefore, my first observation, that then and ever since has illustrated a significant difference between the United States and other democratic industrialized countries. Namely, this country was founded on independence of spirit and a deep-seated distrust of high-handed government. Americans generally don't like being told what to do. Scratch many Americans today, and in my view, you still find a pioneer. In the years leading up to 1776, then, how did the concept of a civilian militia develop? In the early years, other than military operations involving soldiers deployed by the colonial government, local issues of law and order had to be dealt with by local community action. There were no such things as the police. And as resentment against the government of King George III and the conduct of his soldiers mounted, militia groups were formed by the colonists using the individual right to bear arms, often starting as little more than a bunch of farm boys or groups of hot-headed young men in the towns. They were poorly trained and poorly equipped. And yet, in May 1775, Ethan Allen and his 200 Green Mountain Boys surprised and overran the small British garrison in Fort Ticonderoga. George Washington's Continental Army, formed in 1775 by the Second Continental Congress, was a loosely and poorly coordinated band of militias and citizen soldiers. You can see amongst the troops here not much trace of uniform. They were just wearing whatever they normally went out in. They were a coordinated band of militias and citizen soldiers under the control of individual states. And Washington, a trained and experienced leader in the British colonial army during the French and Indian War, had no high opinion of militia at all. He wrote a letter to the President of Congress in 1776, and he said, "To place any dependence upon militia is assuredly resting upon a broken staff." The authors of the 1778 Articles of Confederation were clearly aware of the inadequacies and different standards that existed, and they tried to clarify the role and organization of the militia in the various states. Article 6, Section 5 of the Articles of Confederation contained this: "Every state should always keep up a well-regulated and disciplined militia." Notice the use of this word, well-regulated, sufficiently armed and accoutred. But there was no mention in these Articles of Confederation of the right to keep and bear arms. Why? Because there was no need. It was already widely accepted as a right. And after 1776, the states themselves wrestled with translating their colonial charters into their own constitutions. In New York, for instance, in the face of frequent robberies, law required, quote, "that all men generally be ready and armed and accoutred at the cry of the country to pursue and arrest felons." And in Vermont, the keeping and bearing of arms was not just an abstract right, but also a constant practice of Vermont's founding fathers. Vermont had generally been settled only since 1761. In those days, it was still a wild country. And in 1777, it was decided that Vermont should be a free and independent state, and a Declaration of Rights was adopted that stated this: that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up. That article was repeated in the Vermont Constitution of 1793, and it remains extant today. And Vermont also copied Pennsylvania in declaring, quote, "that the inhabitants of this state shall have liberty to hunt and fowl in seasonable times on the lands they hold and on other lands not enclosed." And it is in that spirit that Vermont today has some of the loosest gun laws in the nation, notwithstanding the changes that were signed into law by Governor Scott in April of this year, which I shall come to later. Each state thrashed out its own constitution and laws according to its own circumstances. For example, under Virginia law, the citizen had a right to keep arms, but the slave did not. Virginia law stipulated, quote, "no Negro or mulatto shall keep or carry any gun, powder, shot, club, or other weapon whatever, except that a bond or free Negro may keep and use a gun by license at frontier plantations." So when the Revolutionary War finally ended in 1783, Washington returned his commission as Commander-in-Chief to Congress and proposed a national standing army with an organized and trained militia, properly equipped, and a military academy. In other words, his idea to have a well-regulated force was to have a military academy with properly equipped and properly trained. But Congress rejected this proposal, preferring yet again the concept of a militia, called as needed by the individual states, preferring that to the idea of a national standing army. And so all this leads me to my second observation, namely, at that time, when there was no longer an external foe, and neither was there any organized force for law and order, militia was seen as the preferred mechanism to be used within the individual states to quell internal disturbance and civil riots, and as a guard against high-handed action by any central federal government. This brings us to the Philadelphia Convention of 1787, by which time it was recognized that neither the original Articles of Confederation nor the Constitution had an agreed Bill of Rights, and there were several other matters that needed correction or addition. In that prolonged negotiation, mistrust of the central government once again came to the fore. The battle of words raged between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and how powers should be divided between the federal center and the individual states. And as we all know, those battles continue even today. Differences of view echoed over the role of the militia. How should the militia be controlled? Who should ensure that the militia were well regulated? And how was that to be done? And in any case, what did well regulated mean? And among the Federalist Papers, the most relevant to this evening's subject was Federalist number 46. Authored by James Madison and published on January the 29th, 1788, it was entitled "The Influence of the State and Federal Governments Compared." And in sum, Madison argued that the federal and state governments had different powers for different purposes, and that the ultimate authority resided in the people alone. To that end, if the federal government took a measure unpopular in particular states and attempt to impose federal will on those states by military force, it should be opposed by a militia, quote, a militia amounting to near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands. Now, it seems to me that it was stemming from this frame of James Madison's mind and his compelling prose, together with the high respect that was accorded to him by his peers, and the powerful effect that the Federalist Papers had on the decision makers, that the eventual wording of what came to be the Second Amendment was born, with its reference to militia and to the right to keep and bear arms. And in addition, Madison wanted to ensure that once agreed, its content could not be overturned. So in 1789, James Madison proposed his long-awaited Bill of Rights. His view was that the rights he proposed did not involve the collective powers of government, but they were individual rights. Throughout his proposed amendments, Madison took the view that federal and state governments had powers, but only people have rights. And it is noteworthy that in the 10 amendments finally approved, the term "the people" or person is used 9 times. This was a view that was to lead to consideration and interpretation of the Supreme Court in later years. And in 2008, in the landmark case of District Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court held in a 5-4 decision that the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to possess a firearm, totally disconnected from service in a militia. In 1789, New York and North Carolina proposed that, quote, that people have a right to keep and bear arms. Madison strengthened this by adding this telling phrase, "This shall not be infringed." Madison also urged that a well-armed and well-regulated militia was the best security of a free country, and in usage of the term free country at the time, free state or free country meant a free political society. And thus emerged the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which, as you all know, reads as follows. But across the Atlantic in Europe, things were very different. No such deep thought, eloquent argument, and articulated opinion was present in the equivalent discussions and varied constitutions of Europe. And of course, the United Kingdom doesn't even have a written constitution. And from this I arrive at my third observation. As far back as 1791, America was already embarked on a different path from Europe as far as civilian gun ownership was concerned. After 1791 and in the decades of the 19th and 20th centuries that followed, democratic institutions were further developed. The Militia Acts of 1792 gave authority to the President to call out the militia, and this authority was used to suppress the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. And over the years, organized militia gave way to the development of the National Guard, and this became the official title in 1903. As a reserve force charged with both state and federal responsibility, as you know, the National Guard has a dual mission. Then the National Guard considers itself as the successor to the concept of a well-regulated militia is evidenced by the fact that it regards its founding date as 1636, and the National Guard badge has a militiaman in its center. The National Guard replaced the concept of militia. And the concept of civil policing to maintain civic law and order in the United States emerged in the 1830s, and then of course later on standing national armies became the international norm. And thus, with the existence in modern times of the standing United States Army, supplemented by the National Guard, and the responsibility for civil law and order in the hands of the police, one wonders how the term well-regulated militia can be at all relevant to modern conditions. Now, all these developments unfolded in the 19th century with scarcely any impact on the matter of guns in civilian hands. Apart from an effort in 1837 by Georgia to ban handguns, which was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, there were no challenges to change the public attitude towards guns. And indeed, as the country expanded westwards, it was generally seen that civil law and order was patchy at best, and the use of arms for personal security was necessary. But while they were common, this did not mean that every household had a gun. Guns were expensive for the average man with slim resources, and moreover, guns rusted easily and had to be maintained. And it seems to me that the next step in America's attitude towards guns was occasioned by the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. The war spurred wider gun ownership, and the agent of change was the manufacturing industry. New designs and new methods of production encouraged new manufacturers and new factories. And by 1865, the Samuel Colt Company, which had been established in 1836, had become the largest private supplier to the Union Army. In 1865, by that time, it had sold 386,417 revolvers in the course of the conflict. And the government, in its own arsenals, made heavy artillery and also carbines, rifles, revolvers, pistols, as well as over 1 billion cartridges, and imported large quantities from European manufacturers. Some 2.5 million men were trained how to use weapons, and when the war was over, the soldiers on both sides were allowed to take their weapons home. In theory, soldiers were supposed to buy their guns, but little serious effort was made to collect the money. So there are now many more guns in society. Again, meanwhile, this was not the case in Europe and the British and other empires. Governments there became more sensitive to the dangers of guns in private hands, particularly in times of civil unrest and possible threats of assassination against royalty and the political leadership. And of course, by that time, there were also police who were responsible for maintaining law and order. And it was not thought necessary for civilians to have guns at all. And without any constitutional provisions, such as a Second Amendment, governments in Europe progressively took steps to assert constraints on gun ownership. And at the same time, it seems that there was more readiness amongst the public at large to accept government authority. So again, Europe and America were on very different tracks. So by the end of the 19th century, three elements of America's attitude to guns were in place. As far as I have read, there was no challenge to the Second Amendment and the right to keep and bear arms. There was a widespread individual ownership of guns, and there were large numbers of factories turning out affordable weapons to meet a popular demand. But as yet, by the end of the 19th century, there was little or no gun culture movement. Then in 1871, two former Unionist soldiers founded an organization that they named the National Rifle Association. The NRA was aimed at improving marksmanship. It was basically a rifle club for Army sharpshooters, and it was supported at that time by various legislatures. In 1903, Congress set up the National Board for the Promotion of Rifle Practice. And supported by President Theodore Roosevelt, this legislation grew out of a desire to improve military marksmanship and national defense preparedness. And among other activities, the board, established by Congress, built rifle ranges for civilians, and the NRA helped to run those ranges, and of course, the membership of the board. In the 1950s, the organization's character changed somewhat. The NRA began to take more interest in sportsmen, organizing training courses for hunters, and teaching classes in gun safety. And yet, in those years, its political impact was still light. In 1968, the assassination of President Kennedy led to the Gun Control Act, by which the selling of guns by post was forbidden. NRA opinion was divided. Some supported that measure, others did not. And steadily a dissident group developed, and it was at the NRA's annual meeting in Cincinnati in May 1977, known ever since colloquially as the Revolt in Cincinnati, the more conservative elements took charge of the NRA. Under the leadership of Hanlon Carter, the NRA became overtly political and endorsed a presidential candidate for the first time, Ronald Reagan, in 1980. And then, by raising membership and dues revenue, the NRA built a new awareness, and it also adopted a policy of identifying and supporting members of Congress who opposed gun control. Owning a gun was not just a recreational activity, it was a symbol of liberty and a valuable means of self-protection. And on the NRA's website, the NRA's motto is this: it's not just about guns, it's about freedom. And I'm sure you'll recall the famous statement by Wayne LaPierre after Sandy Hook: the only way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. So what then is the current situation? In June 2017, the Pew Research Center produced a report under the title America's Complex Relationship with Guns. From a survey of just under 4,000 adults, including 1,269 gun owners, 19% of US gun owners said they belonged to the NRA. NRA members are largely satisfied with the amount of influence the organization has over gun laws in the United States. 63% said the NRA has the right amount of influence, and 28% say it has too little. 9% say it has too much. And among gun owners, 50% view the NRA as too influential. And here are some other statistics from that same report. Now, unsurprisingly, the prevalence of guns has resulted in a significant number of gun deaths. And this is where the great divergence between the United States and other democratic industrialized countries really stands out. According to the University of Washington's Institute for Health Metrics, an evaluation in 2016, the United States had 3.85 deaths per 100,000 people due to gun violence. Now, these numbers exclude suicides. This is deaths due to gun violence. 3.85 deaths per 100,000 is 8 times higher than Canada, 27 times higher than Denmark, over 30 times higher than Germany, 54 times higher than the UK, over 90 times higher than Japan. And yet, well over half gun deaths are suicides. Gun-related suicides are 8 times higher in the United States than in other high-income countries. And as for mass shootings, which might happen anywhere, they are far more numerous in the United States than in any other country. Sandy Hook, the nightclub in Florida in Orlando, Las Vegas, Parkland, Santa Fe, Jacksonville Landing. In 2013, American gun-related deaths included 21,175 suicides, 11,208 homicides. The number of homicides was half the number of suicides, and 505 deaths caused by accidental discharge. In that same year, 2013, that there were something like 32 or 33,000 deaths by guns in the United States. In the same year, in Japan, with 1/3 of America's population, guns were involved in only 13 deaths. In 2015, in England and Wales, a population of 55 million, roughly 1/6 that of the United States, there were 26 fatalities from gun-related crimes. Feeding the interest and demand for guns and ammunition, there is, of course, an energetic firearms industry. According to the 2017 Firearms and Ammunition Industry Economic Impact Report, which is issued by the National Shooting Supports Foundation, the overall economic impact surged from $19.1 billion in 2008 to $51.3 billion in 2016. And all told, the industry supports about 220,000 jobs. Interpretations of the right to bear arms have increasingly widened as the types of weapons have increased. Single-shot weapons are now accompanied by semi-automatic and automatic weapons, which in some instances are not very different from military-style assault weapons. And following the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooting, proposals have been made for congressional action to ban bump stocks. Other proposals have been put forward to ban certain types of ammunition or limit access to guns by more stringent background checks. And then there are open carry and concealed carry, and whether or not guns should be permitted within schools and churches and other places. You'll recall the fierce discussion that took place after the Parkland, Florida school shooting in February this year regarding whether some school teachers should be armed or whether the age limit for purchasing an AR-15 should be raised from 18 to 21. And since the incident in Fairhaven, here in Vermont in February 2019, Vermont laws have been changed to some extent. Background checks for gun buyers will include private arms sales. The minimum age to buy a firearm has been raised to 21. Bump stocks are banned. Magazines are limited to 15 rounds for handguns and 10 rounds for long guns. And the law contained a number of exemptions and grandfather clauses to allow certain magazines still to already possessed still to be retained. So in all these aspects, different states have made different laws. But when challenged, judicial opinion has often reverted again to the basic right to bear arms. In 2008, District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court heard Second Amendment challenges, initiated by a security guard named Dick Heller, to Washington, D.C.'s decades-old ban on handgun possession, and the requirement that D.C. had at that time that firearms in homes should be stored, unloaded, and disassembled or bound by a locking device. And by a 5-4 decision, written by Justice Scalia, the court decided that the Second Amendment guaranteed an individual right to possess a firearm in the home for self-defense, and that this right was not connected with service in a state militia. In making this decision, the court made a dramatic reversal of the previous interpretation, which was United States versus Miller, when that court had stated that the obvious purpose of the Second Amendment was to, quote, assure the continuation and render possible the effectiveness of the state militia, and the amendment must be interpreted and applied with that end in view. So the 5-4 decision in 2008 totally reversed the attitude towards the Second Amendment. In its 2000 decision, the Supreme Court also stated, like most rights, the Second Amendment is not unlimited. It is not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. And the court gave these examples of laws that it considered presumptively lawful. And they included, as you can see, laws prohibiting possession by felons and the mentally ill, laws forbidding possession in sensitive places, such as schools and government buildings, laws that impose conditions on the commercial sales of arms. However, the Supreme Court has never given clear guidance on how lower courts should act. The court has not addressed a Second Amendment case since the 2008 decision, and this has left open several aspects. For instance, some states have regulations regarding open or concealed carry, where others do not. But the underlying constitutional right to keep and bear arms with almost no restriction remains the law of the land. Now, in the meantime, technological developments have continued. We now have Cody Wilson, the founder and director of Defense Distributed, energetically pushing for public access on the web to the blueprints of his 3D printed gun, which he first made in 2012. Cody Wilson, incidentally, has just recently been arrested on charges of having sex with a minor, and he has been put on bail for $150,000, and he has literally today resigned from the directorship of the defense distributed company that he established. In 2013, the State Department told him to take those plans down. But by that time, the plans for the Liberator, his name for the 3D printed gun, had been downloaded on the computer more than 100,000 times. Since then, there have been years of litigation and further technological developments until a settlement in July allowed the release of his downloaded blueprints. On 30th of July, 8 states and the District of Columbia sued to block that release, and on the 1st of August, a federal judge issued a temporary restraining order. But before that date, the downloading had continued. The 3D printed gun gives anyone with a 3D printer the ability to create unregulated, unregistered, and untraceable firearms. And incidentally, Cody Wilson argued that by putting his blueprints on the web, in fact, he was simply exercising his also ancient right to the freedom of information. And what authority did the government have to stop any individual on the freedom of information? Now, I could continue to bombard you with statistics, but now I'm going to sum up with my conclusions. And I have 6. I offer them for what they may be worth, and I emphasize that they are my personal conclusions. Firstly, the United States has an attitude to guns that is very different from all other democratic industrialized countries. Secondly, the wording of the Second Amendment, particularly the reference to a well-regulated militia, has little relevance at all to modern conditions. But the Supreme Court has given its decision, particularly in the 2008 case of DC District versus Heller, and that continues to be how the matter stands. In common with other provisions of the Constitution, the Second Amendment has a treasured place in the legislative structure of this country, and it does not lend itself to repeal or to tinkering alteration. Thirdly, the present situation has arisen from a series of historical steps. In the 1600s, an ancient right and need to keep and bear arms primarily for self-protection. And then in the late 1700s, a deep distrust of high-handed government, which led to the specific provisions of the Second Amendment to the Constitution. Then in the mid-1800s, following the Civil War, an industrialization of production that made guns cheaper and more widely available. And now in the late 1900s and today, the emergence of a vigorous and politicized gun culture, one step after the other. Fourthly, whatever your opinion on gun control may be, the gun industry is a legitimate business. It seeks to make profit and expand where possible, as every business does, and will continue to take actions to resist any challenges to production and sales. And of course, these actions include supporting efforts made by the NRA or other organizations and politicians who are strenuously against gun control. And fifthly, while efforts to achieve gun control at the edges will continue, in my view, the American gun culture is now so soundly established that it is not going to change. You may change the color of the toothpaste, but there's no putting the toothpaste back in the tube. And sixthly, the rest of the democratic industrialized world will continue to regard the American attitude to civilian-owned guns as absolutely crazy. Thank you. Right. Comments? Anybody wants to throw rotten tomatoes and bad eggs at me for these things? Let me, while you're thinking about that, let me offer you another thing. It's interesting to consider the etymology of to keep and to bear. The verb to bear has an amazing number of meanings and different applications in the English language. To bear fruit, to bear a child, to bear witness, to bear tidings, to bear down, to bear against, to bear away, a nautical term meaning to move away from a certain point of the wind, and to bear arms, to bring to bear upon. And even then, to bear has had more than one meaning. In Norman and Old French, in about 1100, it meant to serve as a soldier. It also meant carrying a weapon, and in medieval times it also meant carrying the colours of the lord or the regiment or the religious emblems of a saint. In 1442, according to the rolls of Parliament regarding King Henry VI, quote, "The said carracks arrived and entered," carracks being vessels, arrived and entered the port of the Isle of Rhodes, bearing the arms of the Hospital of St. John, Jerusalem. So this word to bear has many meanings. Here in the American colonies, by the latter part of the 18th century, to bear arms meant to have a weapon for service in the militia and for self-defense. And thus, as I quoted before, the Pennsylvania Constitution said people have the right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. But to have a weapon available for such purposes also carried a requirement to have the weapon in the house. And so we arrive at that other verb, to keep. And in the context of the early American Republic, which had no standing army and no state militias, it was thought necessary for every able-bodied man to have a weapon and ammunition, and to keep the weapon and the ammunition well maintained and to be proficient in its use. And so the verb to keep was just as important as the verb to bear. Steve.
Derek, thanks. As always, eloquent and scholarly. If the Supreme Court was comprised of Hamilton and Jay and Madison, the authors of the Federalist, and met in 2008 to consider the Heller question, do you think they would have arrived at the same conclusion that Scalia and his four colleagues did in the Heller case?
Certainly they would not have agreed with Justice Scalia. You all heard that question, yes? You know, I mean, the way that the Second Amendment is phrased, a well-regulated militia being necessary to you know, which is the primary clause and which is the secondary clause, you know, and the way that it's stated at that time, it seems to me that the primary clause is the well-regulated militia, and the rest was secondary. It depended. It was conditional on the first part of the phrase. But that, as I say, at that time there was no standing army, there was no police and law and order. Militia was the only way, to assert community protection and defense, and those views were entirely set aside by Justice Scalia in 2008.
Scalia, the originalist.
Well, that's right, Scalia, the originalist. But I mean, and of course, as I said, it really hasn't been challenged ever since. And neither has the Supreme Court sought to offer to the lower courts any further interpretation. I mean, they probably realize it's a very hot potato and don't want to touch it with a barge pole, I should imagine.
Didn't some earlier versions of that, not the one finally adopted, also address conscientious objection and other things related to military service versus...
Sorry, I can't quite hear.
Sorry, didn't earlier versions of this that were not passed address the right of conscientious objection as well as relating to military service as well as just keeping guns?
Yeah, I think they did. Certainly, I can't say that I have read all this. I mean, look how thick it is. But I really dipped into it fairly well. And there was a lot of extensive discussion at that time around what about conscientious objectors? Conscientious objectors for religious purposes, of course, because religion featured much higher in social consideration in those days than it does now. So there were those kinds of things around, but in the end, it seems to me it was Madison, and as I think some of you have heard me say before, I had never come across the Federalist Papers before I came to the United States, I am blown away by the intellectual power and the depth of thought and consideration that James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and to a lesser extent John Jay put into the Federalist Papers. Bearing in mind, of course, that they were at that time were doing something that had never been done before. They were inventing a form of government that no other country ever had. All other countries had authoritarian or monarchs or monarchies, and they were trying to weigh up how it should all be done. The things that James Madison came up with his, if you remember, he put forward 12 amendments, and the Congress Constitutional Convention accepted only 10, and those are the American Bill of Rights, right? But fundamentally, I think there was a lot of discussion at the time of what they should do about conscientious objectors, and how did that fit in, and of course the tussle between states' rights and federal rights, which, as I said in my piece, even continues today. George Washington, when the Continental Army was first formed, there was still the big dispute between the southern states, the southern colonies at that time, who were aristocratic landowners, slave owners, as opposed to the mercantile interests of the northern colonies. If the northern colonies had not agreed that a southerner, namely George Washington from Virginia, should be actually the appointed to be in charge of the Continental Army, probably the southern states would never have agreed to the establishment of the Continental Army. I mean, such was the tussle that went on between the North and the South, and between the individual states. Sorry, at the back, and then I'll come. Yes, sir.
Derek, moving to today's gun control situation, do you have a sense of the difference in availability, if you will, between guns that are sold through licensed dealers who supposedly are on a network of reporting, and, if you will, over the under the counter sales of weapons that permeate?
Do I have a sense of the
sourcing of guns today in America between licensed dealers and essentially anyone who wants to sneak a bunch of guns in? And
yeah, I don't have any particular anything to offer on that. I have to say, I personally, although I tried in my piece to sort of give you the historical background, I entirely agree with my own conclusion 6. I think Americans are crazy. It seems to me, without amending the Second Amendment as such, there is room for there to be some constraints, i.e., why not make sure that if a household has a gun, it's kept in a separate room from the ammunition? Why should there not be a locked cabinet? I mean, you know, we had this awful thing here in Manchester itself just a few years ago, when there was a loaded weapon on the wall of a children's room. You remember that situation? A loaded weapon on the wall of a children's room, and there were 2 teenage boys, and one was sleeping rather heavily, and the other, the visiting boy, I think it was the visiting boy, in order to, as a joke, in order to wake him up, saw the gun on the wall, pulled it off, pointed it at the boy in the expectation that it would go click, and it actually went bang, and it killed him. And that happened here in Manchester. I think it's nonsense. Sorry, there was one over here, Axel, and I'll come back.
Actually, before I get to my question, I just want to make the comment that my wife and I have traveled quite a bit in Europe, and we've had these discussions with Britain, with British people, and with people from France and Belgium and Switzerland, and they don't get it, and we've come to the opposite conclusion that they're all nuts. And it's really, I understand the genesis of it. I get where it's coming from. Their society largely comes from a feudal past where the people were not allowed to own firearms, and they're more willing to tolerate government control. But going back to something that you said, and I'm not quite sure what the quote was from the Federalist Papers by Madison, to the effect that the Second Amendment, it says there shall not be infringed, but also that it may not be modified. I think you said something.
No, the phrase that Madison himself put in was shall not be infringed. There was no other phrase that or be modified.
Okay, then taking that and moving it forward, what really has changed since the Second Amendment was implemented? Really, I don't see a great deal that has changed. Yes, we have a National Guard, we have a standing army, but the intent, if you're an originalist like Scalia, you look at the Constitution, and I know that there's a lot of back and forth on originalism and the living Constitution, but I look at it and say the Constitution is the Constitution. And when you talk about a well-regulated militia, one of the reasons that the American troops during the Revolution were so successful against the British was because in some cases they had weapons that outperformed the British troops in terms of range and accuracy. And now we're looking at, in the state of Vermont, you can own a semi-automatic rifle, but it can only have a 10-round magazine. You can own a handgun, it can only have 14 rounds in it. And the intent in the original Constitution was to have a militia that could stand up to a tyrannical government on at least equal terms, at least equal. Now, I grant you, we're not allowed under most circumstances to own machine guns or mortars or heavy weapons, but a well-regulated militia having a standard shoulder weapon or sidearm that's at least the equivalent of military, I think that was the intent.
But then you have the National Guard, which itself claims that it, as I showed you, it claims that it was established in 1636. The National Guard claims that it replaces the national militia.
Claim anything they want, but there's nothing in the Constitution.
Oh, I agree.
It says that the National Guard has replaced the militia. Nothing.
But let me. You touch on. You think the Europeans are nuts.
Not just the Europeans.
No, and all non-Americans perhaps, right? The country of Iceland has got a population of 300,000. That's half the population of Vermont, right? Of 300,000, there are 100,000 guns in Iceland. They haven't had a death by gun violence since 2007. 2007. What?
They're all related.
Yeah, well, whatever. But what I'm getting at is that I think there's also a different attitude, for a whole kind of historical reasons, to violence in the United States.
No, but the genesis of their gun ownership is probably purely for hunting. They did not fight a revolution. They did not overthrow a British army. They didn't have to contest their own frontier. They had none of this. And I think this is what makes America unique and singular in the experience of guns. There haven't really been revolutions.
Right, but in the end you finish up with there are more guns, more suicides by guns. It's much more difficult for people to actually throw a rope over a beam and commit suicide or plunge a knife into their chest. But if you have the prevalence of guns that there is in the United States, you have a situation where 21,000 suicides versus 11,000 guns deaths by violence. If there weren't as many guns, probably there wouldn't be as many suicides. Let's move. Let's move along. Who was around? Axel, and then I'll come back.
You seem to say that as part of the development of the law, all our educational schools are free from arms. Is that part of the federal law that there should not be arms within any public school? Which brings me to the question of the moment, which is Mrs. DeVos, the present Secretary of Education, promoting that every professor keep an arm within the school to protect the school. I mean, isn't that crazy? I mean, what is going on here?
Well, that's part of the argument that's going on, isn't it? I mean, look at the appalling things that happened in Parkland, you know. But how do you protect schools? And of course, as we all know, it's much more difficult for schools these days. Correct me if I'm wrong. Anybody from BBA, the students, to correct me, try to limit entry. They don't have as many doors for people to go into schools. And should you actually have locks on internal doors so that students can protect themselves? I mean, it's part of the ongoing argument, and there is no easy answer, it seems to me. And there are those who, as you say, will disagree with what DeVos is doing, to which, of course, the people on the other side of the fence sort of say, well, in which case we ought to actually arm one or two properly trained teachers, and have properly trained teachers and have them with concealed weapons, so anybody coming in wouldn't know who they might, and that itself would be a deterrent. And we can argue that until the cows come home, you know.
Well, even addressing that, before I make my point, I was a high school teacher, and when I started back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, you could enter the building 10 different places. No one would stop you, no one would question you. Today, there's only one way in that building, and there is a policeman who is armed. He doesn't walk around waving the gun, and people don't feel that bad that he's there. It's really not an issue. However, something I thought was of interest when I was listening to this, and the talk was a masterpiece. A friend of mine, a very good friend, is a member of the NRA and does not own a gun. He just believes in the idea of freedom and the well-regulated militia, the whole thing, but he doesn't own a gun. But after a particularly violent weekend in Chicago, I think it was the NRA that issued a statement about it, that I forget how many people committed the crimes with guns, that not one of them was a member of the NRA. 2, not one of them used a gun that was legally registered. And 3, they listed all the laws that were on the books, that were anti-gun laws, that were not either enforced or obeyed. To me, I have such mixed feelings about guns. I think the real problem is the people. If we made guns illegal and we could really get them off the market, those with bad intents would still get them.
Yeah. Can I go to the back? And
I'm listening to your conversation, and I'm a member of the NRA, and have been for 45 years. My personal experience, we talked about where people get guns. I grew up in New Jersey. When I was 15, I walked to school with a single-shot 22 caliber target rifle, walked into the office, handed it to the secretary. She put it in the corner of the principal's office, and when school was over, I picked it up, went around it. I learned to shoot in the basement of the high school. Today, the SWAT team will be out. But his point also, 1976, my brother-in-law wanted to sell me a double-barrel shotgun to go rabbit hunting with him. I had to apply, you fingerprinted 3 times. 1 sent to the FBI, 1 to the state police, 1 to my local police in the town I lived in all my life. Never ever been in trouble. Been in the police station once because a buddy of mine's father was a cop and I was riding with him one day. 2 months and a week later, I got permission in order to purchase a double-barrel shotgun, an old double-barrel shotgun. During that time period, a buddy of mine worked as a truck driver in North New Jersey because we only lived one town away. I mentioned to him how long it was taking. He mentioned it to some of the guys he worked with. I was told if I could be trusted, I could come that night with cash to Newark and buy anything up to and including a Thompson submachine gun. But if I snitched on him, I was dead. You're not going to get bad guns out of the hands of bad people. You can't stop drugs coming across the border. You think you're going to stop a gun? That's ridiculous. Nobody with any common sense would think that you could do it.
Well, that's partly why I personally think the toothpaste can't be put in the tube, back in the tube. I mean, it's all gone so far that there is no now. The American attitude here has gone in that direction, and other countries have gone in the other direction, and there is no way of bringing those back together.
Let's see, we got the personal experience. I'm 17. There's riots in North New Jersey. They're less than a mile away from my home. The word came out that certain people were going to march. They could nothing left to loot in New York, so they were going to come out and burn out the rest of us. My father took that single-shot 22 and made a barricade in the corner and left me with a baseball bat to protect my mother and everything they'd worked all their lives. I'll never be put in that position again. A year later, I'm in a band in high school. We're playing in another town that is highly minority. It was getting pretty ugly because we're winning in the middle of the 3rd quarter. And the band director said, I think we better get to the buses. Well, 80% of the kids in the band were female. I'm in the color guard. I'm walking out front with a fake gun, pushing my way through a crowd of very angry people that I did nothing to, and I had nothing against. They threw stones at our buses. I'm running a retail store. I have a guy come in late April in a long sheep herder's coat. It's 75 degrees outside and humid. He goes up to the cashier. I got a 16-year-old girl up by the front door. I come up there, I look, and I see a car with New York plates with a guy behind the wheel running in the fire zone, no parking zone in front of the store. I looked into a pair of pale blue eyes with wide pupils and put his hand inside his belt and grabbed a pistol, and I about pooped my pants. That's one of the reasons I moved the heck out of New Jersey. Because in New Jersey, you cannot have a way to defend yourself. And the bad people will continue to get violent.
Yeah. Mark and then Jeffrey. Go on.
As you probably know, I tend to be allergic to current events. So let me address this question, your 6th conclusion, the one about North American lunacy. And the impression, what I'm about to say is not a defense of anything, but it is an appeal to understanding the basis of lunacy. This is not a genetic issue with Americans. They're not born lunatic. But it is, in the end, your fault, by which I mean the English. Very briefly, European countries are known as old lands or old countries, and their possessions, Spain, England, Portugal, took temporary possessions of so-called new lands. And new lands were, by definition, ample in territory, low in population, which means access to frontiers became part of the chemistry. Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, Mexico, etc. Canada, eventually the United States. That sense of freedom that comes with being new lands is very heady. And it allows for the notion of self-defense to flourish as a natural right. Your people, by which I mean the British Crown, made it its business to have a relatively unregulated possession. Indeed, each of the eventual states had its own charter.
That's right.
Not a unified charter. My people, Spanish Americans, had a centralized regimen of possession. The sense of frontier was subjugated to the crown in that case. In the North American case, freedom was the freedom of the frontier. And I don't mean Ohio, I mean Boston. as a political country. And I think we have to understand that the craziness or the lunacy, whichever way you want to put it, is not a modern affair. It is a deep cultural, longitudinal issue. That toothpaste was squeezed out in the 17th century and in the 18th century. Not.
Yeah, but life has changed, Mark. Well,
No,
I mean,
I understand.
you know, Australia was a frontier country as well. Australia had a mass killing, and the public reacted so energetically that they called for a handing in of guns, no questions asked. And now it is extremely difficult in Australia, which was a frontier country, to have guns at all.
I recognize the Australian case as being exceptional. What I'm saying
No, not not exceptional.
But what I'm saying is that the notion of less regulated freedom is peculiar to new lands and not so strange in Europe. That's my only point.
Well,
It's a centralized power.
Jeffrey.
You done exactly what I was going to mention. Australia was the site.
Can you speak up so that other people?
Sorry. Port Arthur in the southern part of the country was a tourist attraction. It was an old penal colony, and a mentally disturbed young man came in, and I can't remember the exact numbers. It was somewhere around 25 to 35 people were killed. And there was such an uprising and feeling amongst the population, who, the majority of whom have dealt with guns, have handled guns, and I'm not talking about the more recent growth, but I'm talking about the earlier settlers, earlier population of Australia, which until the mid-1950-ish was less than 20 million people. The farming community, guns were all over the place, but there was such a huge revolt amongst people to say, we do not want this situation. John Howard, the then Prime Minister, persuaded Parliament to bring in a law that guns would be banned unless they were licensed, unless they were used on the farms and what have you. And if you looked at the chart that Derek put up, Australia was well down the bottom in terms of the number of people killed by guns per 100,000.
Yeah. But no, I mean, I as a matter of comparison, I looked at how difficult it is to own a gun in UK. Now, in UK, you have to have a firearms license. Most types of guns are banned, but in order to get a firearms license, which lasts 5 years and then has to be renewed, the police have to be satisfied that a person has a good reason to own each firearm, and self-defense is not considered a valid reason. The police then say, self-defense? No, that's the police's job. What else do you have? They basically, now that doesn't stop the bad people getting guns, and there are, but there are just many, many fewer guns. In Iceland, yes, with all these guns, it can take between 2 and 3 years to get a firearms license. They have to have a medical check and a psychological check and an assurance and an interview with the police, and the police reserve the right to interview the applicant's relatives and friends to have their opinion about the attitude. So these things happen. And then, of course, the other aspect is that if there was, without changing the Second Amendment, without infringing on people's rights to have guns, it seems to me much more sensible to sort of say guns should be in a lockable container in a house, and the ammunition should be kept separate. But I do accept that. Look at what's happening in Chicago. I mean, the number of people, I mean, what did they have had? Over 500 deaths this year. And in those circumstances, there are people who have guns who sort of say, look, I can't afford to have my gun in one room and the ammunition in another and the gun locked up. By the time I actually find the key and undo it, I'm dead. And that's the situation as well. Mary.
We haven't spoken about the economic issue. How many companies are there, gun manufacturers, in England, France, Spain, Italy? Are they all here in America? Handguns, I'm speaking.
No, there are.
There are many in America, and economically, they're making a lot of money. I know that for certain. And they advertise, and they're always...
Well, as I say, I mean,
We don't speak about it.
they support, I did mention that, if you remember. I said that the gun industry...
The industry is large here. Where is it as large? Any of the other countries?
I don't think it's as large in the other countries, and they're very much more government controlled. Sorry?
Germany has a
Yeah, Germany, Italy, the Beretta, for instance. Yeah, and yeah, the handguns. Yes.
Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, Czechoslovakia. Yes. I mean,
More regulated.
they're more regulated. They're more regulated on the production, but the gun industry here in the United States supports 220,000 jobs. That's a lot of jobs, you know. I mean, and it's a legitimate business, and one can't. Having accepted that it's legitimate, they're going to do whatever they can to promote the sales and the production. And if that means advertising in the NRA's magazines, if that means supporting behind the scenes the NRA, who blames them? They're in business, you know. Don.
Last January, I want to address the point about how sometimes impractical it is to break apart a gun and have it in different places in the house. The ammunition here and the gun over here and so forth. Last January in Arlington, Vermont, we lost a resident, an 83-year-old resident, Mrs. Jones. And for several months, the state police conducting their investigation had no idea who had committed the murder. They had some suspects, but until March, there was no arrest. However, in the meantime, there was a run on guns in Bennington, Pittsfield, and Massachusetts, and folks from this area going down buying guns, right? Not long guns, but revolvers and handguns to protect themselves. Because here in Vermont, as many of you know, from I think it's 1 o'clock in the morning till 6 o'clock, we have no coverage with the state police. You happen to have a police force here in Manchester. I don't know if it might be covered, but in many places there's no coverage. So you need some. Some people think they need protection. So that was an interesting part when I hear about if you're going to have a gun for self-protection, it makes no sense to have it the ammunition over here and the gun over here broken apart. And also, if that's going to be a law, who's going to enforce that? And I go back to some of the questions about the licensing. When I first came to Vermont, where Stewart's is now, is a place called Leo's. Some of you may remember Leo's. I was able to get a gun from Leo, go down to Sunderland for the weekend and use it. And I said, I'm going back to New York, and I had to get back to him because I couldn't take it into New York. But it took me 6 months to get licensed in New York to bring the gun into New York. 6 months to get a license. I went through the same fingerprinting and FBI checks and everything else. And as some of you may know, I worked for the Secret Service in the Marine Corps with the Presidential Guard. I knew a lot about guns, and I had that background. And even with that, I had to go through that. You only mentioned once in the whole material mental illness. And I think it came in the 2008 decision. And I think there's a correlation in this country between the mental illness and drugs, and why we have such a radical increase in violence, or gun violence.
Derek, I've got a question for your audience, which is, do the audience in general think that we live in a more lawless society? does this audience think that we live in a more lawless society than our British friends, our French friends, Spanish, others?
So the question is, does the audience, do people in the audience think that here in the United States we live in a more lawless society than in other democratic industrialized countries? Any comments on that? Yeah.
I think it's possible in inner cities where there's a big drug culture, big drug trade, and people are fighting for turf. I think there. The town I live in New York, you never hear of a gun crime, because it's not that problem that you would have in the inner city, say for example in Chicago.
Yeah.
And London is experiencing a problem right now, and there's been quite a bit of publicity about it. Not gun violence, knife violence.
Yeah, oh, nice.
It's all to do with the gangs, and unfortunately they're mainly the children of immigrants who, like many of the deprived population in this country, have no future or don't see that they have a future. They rely on the trading of drugs to get any sort of money, and they fight to protect their turf. And in London, there have been a whole series of deaths amongst young children, young people of immigrant backgrounds over the last few months.
Yes.
It's a major problem.
Sorry, you put... Yes?
I did. I grew up in I don't think I'm that old, I just turned 60, but I'm the youngest child in the family. This is my dad, who's 89, who's a member of the NRA, and my brothers used to drive to high school with a gun rack and two long rifles in the back window. And that was accepted years ago at our schools in Vermont. I'm a Vermonter. All of my brothers are hunters, and I'm a hunter. I have a firearm. I was in law enforcement, but I'm no longer. I'm behind the desk now. I carry firearms. You get the training. You have to have the education. You have to have the support of your parents, and you have to. This culture that we have here today is wrong. What he said about the people selling things, selling drugs to get their money, to get the guns and stuff. There was a woman on TV in Vermont that sits on her butt on the street collecting money from everybody that walks by, and she makes more money than the governor does. She said that on TV.
Yeah, well, we're getting into a different... Let's have one more. Steve.
Well, I wanted to answer the question of the audience. I don't know about lawless, because I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I think that the statistics make it absolutely clear that we live in a more violent society.
Yes, more violence.
Many more deaths by violence, most of them caused by guns, than in any of the other industrialized democratic countries.
That's absolutely true. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm an international student from China, so I came here last year. I don't think you guys probably don't think China is a democratic country or not because of communism or not. But I don't really care. But like, as long as like in my life, I live in China and I can go out at 2 a.m. in the morning and no one, I have never felt unsafe. But like here in Manchester, and I even regard Vermont as like the safest state in the world, like not in America. I even like sometimes like at 10 o'clock when I walk sometimes from the gym to my dorm, I'll sometimes feel unsafe because I have heard a lot of like gun violence news recently and it made me feel so unsafe. But like in China, even like in my province, Xinjiang, we're struggled with terrorism problems for like 10 years. I have never felt unsafe at 2 o'clock to walk down the street to a restaurant in the morning. I mean, this is like really obvious.
There now. Look, you've been very patient, and it's already 2 minutes past 7. The gentleman at the back here, yeah.
They talk about us being lawless. If we enforced the laws that we have, we wouldn't have all the problems that we've got now.
Yeah, if we enforce the laws that we have, we wouldn't have the problem. Thank you all very much. You've been very patient. Thank you.